Hello, and welcome to South Pole, the podcast that explores everything Antarctica. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and today we are talking about wildlife diseases and how the avian flu made its way all the way down to Antarctica. You may have seen in the news in the last couple of years an increasing number of stories about the avian flu, or the bird flu, and how it's spreading across the globe. And if you've been to the grocery store while this is happening, you may have seen all the eggs are either gone or the ones that are left are the price of diamonds. Well, avian flu would be the reason for that. Unfortunately, this disease is spreading so far in part because birds have wings that fly, and they have used those wings to fly the virus so far down that it has now reached the pristine and remote environment of Antarctica. So today we're going to dive into this pressing issue with the help of Dr. Meagan Dewar, a renowned specialist in wildlife diseases in Antarctica. Dr. Dewar is a lecturer at the Federation University Australia. Her research focuses on host microbiome interactions and the pathogens affecting Antarctic and subantarctic wildlife. In this episode, we'll explore how the avian flu found its way down to Antarctica and the effects it's having on the region's wildlife and the mitigation strategies being implemented to combat its spread. And with that, let's get started. All right, welcome, Dr. Dewar. Thank you for coming on the show today. Maybe I'll have you start by just introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your research.
Yes, so I'm Dr. Meagan Dewar. I'm a wildlife biologist from Federation University in Australia. Most of my research focuses on host microbes in marine wildlife, so mainly looking at penguins, flying seabirds, and sharks.
Okay, so the coolest job ever. One question I like to ask is, has your research ever taken you down to Antarctica? And if so, maybe you can tell us about some of the projects that took you down?
Yeah, so I've been down a few times to Antarctica, and just this season I went down twice. So most of my research focuses on looking at the microbial community in animals, but to sort of understand, I guess, who lives there and what organisms are present, we sort of need to get a baseline understanding of who's there on a regular basis, and then we can start to look at how that community might change under different conditions. And also, I've started doing a lot of disease surveillance work as well. So it enables us to see if there's any new and emerging pathogens that have arrived in the area. So for the last few seasons, I've been heading down to Antarctica, mainly on the peninsula, working with some of the tourist vessels and going to different locations and collecting fecal samples from different wildlife species to study the microbes. And then this year as well, unfortunately, avian influenza was a big concern. And so I had an expedition recently in March to go down and actually survey for the presence of avian influenza.
So your research does focus on a number of different diseases and pathogens among the Antarctic wildlife, but would you say then that the avian influenza is the most concerning at the moment?
So a lot of my, I guess, work has been focused on doing disease surveillance in general, sort of looking at all potential pathogens, trying to understand which ones might naturally occur within the population. But probably the two more recently that have been of concern is, of course, avian influenza, and the other one is Pasteurella multocida, which causes avian cholera. But some of our recent work has shown that it is a pathogen that seems to circulate within the populations, but doesn't necessarily cause outbreaks all the time. So understanding what factors causes that to start to become a pathogenic and a concern to animals.
So if we're going to try and understand where these diseases come from, how they enter the population, would you classify them as naturally occurring, or do we see a direct link between human activities and human influence?
So you have got some that will naturally occur and circulate within the population, but then certainly we have got some that are going to be of more concern with climate change. So as temperatures change around the world, species migration paths are changing. We have species moving down towards the Antarctic that never were there before. And also some of the species that do come down there are sort of acting with other animals they never would have normally. And so therefore they can start to get pathogens from each other that way. But we also have that risk of introducing things as well when we visit, if we're not following really good biosecurity measures, but then also with our farming practices and things like that. So having diseases spread over from agricultural practices into wildlife, and then that moving down towards the Antarctic. So it's kind of a combination of natural, but also climate change and human mediated.
Also, one thing I'm just super curious about is with climate change, obviously there's concern of ice melt. And is there concern about pathogens that were perhaps once frozen in the ice, but now that there's, that it's melting, that they could potentially spread? Is that something that your research touches on at all?
Yeah, we haven't done, I guess, as much research on this as sort of the Arctic region. So definitely in the Arctic, they have found some pathogens like anthrax and so forth being exposed from carcasses that were buried for long periods of time in the permafrost. And there is that risk that there are pathogens that manage to survive in those frozen habitats that could escape, but there hasn't been, I guess, a lot of research on those sort of frozen landscapes.
Okay, well then I suppose we will continue to watch this space. But back to the topic of the day, which is the avian influenza. Most people have probably heard of this in the news, partly because you go to the grocery store and the eggs are now $20. But for anyone who hasn't heard of it, can you just tell us a little bit about this disease, how it affects birds, how does it spread? Does it only affect birds? Maybe just a general understanding of what the disease is.
Yep. So avian influenza is a type of influenza A virus that predominantly does infect birds, but can infect other species as well, but predominantly birds, which is often why it's referred to as avian influenza. It's generally grouped into two main categories. So we have low pathogenic avian influenza. These are variants that cause little to no disease in animal species. They're often found in many wild birds, and seabirds often are reservoirs of low pathogenic avian influenza. And then we have our high pathogenic avian influenza, which causes severe disease and illness in both poultry and wild birds, and often has a very high mortality rate associated with it. And so generally what happens is low pathogenic avian influenza over from wild birds into poultry, and then it mutates into a higher pathogenic variant. Normally, we have outbreaks just within poultry farms. Any outbreaks that you have, as you know, your chicken, your eggs are now $20. You'll go through, and any infected flock, the entire flock will be killed to try and prevent the virus spreading out any further to other locations. And every now and then, you used to get some spillovers into wild birds, but you'd have sort of local outbreaks, nothing really, really big. But then in about 2021, we started getting large spillovers into seabirds. And so we got a massive outbreak that's been happening globally around the world. And so generally, it is spread by respiratory droplets, animals sneezing, coughing. The normal way flu gets transferred, but then also what we call the fecal oral route. And this is where infected birds will defecate into the environment, most likely usually into water sources, and then other healthy animals go and either drink or bathe in that water source or in the environment and ingest the virus that way. For a lot of our scavengers, they will often get infected by eating infected birds. So they're the sort of main routes that it sort of travels. In terms of the only birds get it, no. Mammals have always been susceptible, including ourselves. It is a zoonotic disease, but generally it was more, again, when predators and so forth would eat infected birds, they would get the virus. However, we are starting to potentially see some other changes happening with the most recent virus.
Okay, vocabulary word. Zoonotic disease, simply put, is an infectious disease which can pass from animals to humans. Rabies, Lyme disease, and yes, COVID-19 are famous examples. But then I guess the reason we're talking about this today is because the avian flu has made its way all the way down to Antarctica. Can you tell me what we need to know about it? Is it contained? Is it not contained?
Yeah, so sadly, in February, we confirmed our first case in Antarctica. And on my recent expedition in March, we confirmed it at 4 new locations. And so we have confirmed cases down pretty much both sides of the Antarctic Peninsula. in skuas. So that's a large predatory scavenging seabird that we get down there. And unfortunately, yeah, it's not contained. It's not something that's easily contained in the wild areas. And unfortunately, when we were down in March, we did detect a mass mortality event in skuas. So there was around 50 birds that were dead out of about 130 that were on the island that we were at.
Oh my gosh. So what are the potential consequences of continued uncontrolled spread?
If we have a look, the best example of understanding what might happen is what we saw in South Georgia, so sub-Antarctic island, just south of South America, where we've seen, unfortunately, large mass mortality events in southern elephant seal pups and a number of seabirds there, and it's spread quite rapidly throughout this season. So it's very dependent on the species that it gets into and which ones will be more susceptible. Because a lot of the species haven't been affected before, it's difficult to predict exactly which ones are going to be the most susceptible. But given penguins live in very large, dense colonies, it has the potential to cause severe losses at many colonies. If we look at to the north, the great skuas had 60 to 70% of their populations lost at some locations. So if we got those sort of losses down in Antarctica, that could have significant impacts on a lot of species that are already under threat from things like climate change, fisheries, habitat destruction. So we could have huge consequences.
Yeah, 60 to 70%, that's kind of alarming. And you mentioned that it can also spread to mammals. Other than elephant seals, do we know of any other Antarctic mammals that have been affected by this yet?
Sub-Antarctic fur seals as well have also been affected. So they're the two main seal species that have been impacted that we do know of at the moment. A lot of the other species we get down south, like the leopard seals and crab-eater seals and Weddell seals, often don't sort of breed or congregate in large groups like the other two species do. So it can be quite difficult to know if they've been impacted unless you find a carcass. And unfortunately, many animals will die at sea, and we won't ever get to count those or know what happened.
Okay, I know the ocean is really big, but I'm going to ask because you said one way that the disease spreads is by entering a water source. So if it enters the ocean or marine mammal carcasses enter the ocean environment, is that a concern for wide-scale marine contamination?
Probably not at this scale. The ocean's very large, so it'll be quite diluted, and it often freshwater sources, pools of water and so forth. So sort of smaller bodies of water will be affected. The ocean should sort of dilute it quite a bit more. The risk of, I guess, animals dying at sea is scavenging on those that otherwise potentially wouldn't have been affected.
Okay, so we also mentioned how climate change can increase disease risk, and we know that climate change is human generated. But I guess the question of the day when it comes to the avian flu is, did humans cause this? Is this our fault?
In one part, yes. So especially with our farming practices and things like that. So as we know, the virus is generally from low pathogenic avian influenza spilling over into poultry farms, and then where our high path viruses then sort of come from. And then, having, I guess, large mass scale farming practices of our poultry, and these being close or near water sources where wildlife are. So, it does sort of, I guess, help create the high pathogenic forms and then the spread as well.
Are there any public health implications for humans with the spread of avian flu throughout Antarctica or elsewhere?
So it is a zoonotic disease, as we said. So humans are susceptible to this virus, and sadly people have been infected. However, those have generally been people working in farms, people working in live animal markets and so forth. So generally people with close contact with infected animals. So for the general public, the World Health Organization still considers the risk quite low. And generally for tourists visiting Antarctica, there are a lot of biosecurity measures and safety guidelines in place. And as long as tourists are following the approach limits that we have, so generally guests are to stay 5 meters from wildlife. That's generally to reduce the stress and disturbance on the wildlife, but that actually also helps to reduce your risk as well because you're not up close and personal with the animals. For people working with wildlife in close proximity, as long as they're wearing the appropriate personal protective gear, the risk is very low for them being infected. So there is the risk, but there are measures in place to reduce those risks.
And I suppose that those measures to protect ourselves can also serve as basically the best that we can do to limit our contribution to the spread, at least through our immediate interactions with these wildlife. But aside from minimizing our own risk and minimizing how we contribute to the spread in a direct sense, is there anything that we can do to try and control the spread among wild populations?
Yeah, unfortunately, once it arrives in the populations, there's not a lot we can do to stop the spread amongst the wildlife. And so unfortunately, we do just have to watch and monitor what's happening with the populations to certainly reducing our spreading of the virus, or the potential that we could do that does assist, but also looking at strategies back home. Potentially, hopefully, we're going into winter now. Most of the wildlife populations have left Antarctica, but then there's the risk it will get reintroduced next year. And so looking at strategies and ways of reducing the spread of the virus back home so that new variants and things don't make their way down.
All right. Well, as we start to round out the episode, is there anything that we missed today that you think is important to talk about with the avian flu or wildlife diseases in Antarctica more broadly?
I guess the big thing is there's not a lot that it has been done. So it's still an area that we don't fully understand, which has been one of the biggest challenges in preparing for avian influenza, that we don't have a lot of knowledge and research on pathogens down there. Historically, everyone thinks, it's so isolated. It's one of the most pristine places in Earth, but now we know that's not the case. So, we do need to start to look at wildlife disease in more depth and get a better understanding of how pathogens might arrive. So new pathogens are, unfortunately, bird flu is probably not going to be our last outbreak we see. So starting to learn from this outbreak, but continuing that research as well. So that's, probably the biggest thing is, advancing our research and getting more investment into that.
Okay, well then I'll also thank you for the work that you are doing to advance our knowledge in this space. To try and end on more of a positive note, I'm going to ask you, what is your favorite thing about Antarctica?
Oh, wow. I think it's a combination between the wildlife that you get to see down there, amazing, massive, colonies. You can go to places like the Danger Islands where there's colonies of nearly 300,000 penguins, but then as you'll sail past, massive iceberg, and it's just a crazy, amazing landscape and wildlife colonies that you sort of don't get to see anywhere else. It's very hard to explain, but it's something that does draw you in and you get addicted. And
well, I mean, who wouldn't love a penguin? But also, this is a podcast, so people can't see, but the background of your Zoom is a bunch of penguins and seals and birds. Yeah. So it's clearly a passion of yours. That's amazing.
Yep.
I guess the last question I have for you is, where can people follow your work and stay up to date on this topic?
Yes, so I guess website, so Federation University Australia. Also on Instagram, Dr. Meagan Dewar. And those are the main areas that we sort of post, and also on X as well. So I post a fair bit of my research stuff there. So hopefully some new stuff to come out soon.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll put links to that in the episode description so that people can find you easily. And this is the part where I say thank you again so much for coming on today, for teaching us about this, and for the work that you're doing in this space.
Thank you.
Okay, a major thank you to Dr. Meagan Dewar. And I guess the major takeaway is we really got to change our farming practices, because it seems like the outbreaks in Antarctica are fairly likely to occur again next season. And I really don't want a bunch of penguins to die, and I really don't want to get stuck inside my house again for 2 years. So irresponsible animal agriculture has really caused a lot of problems for us. And we really need to take this seriously. As I said, there will be some links in the show notes to follow this issue going further. And I think that's all I have for you today. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. You've been listening to South Pole. You can find more information about this week's guest and links to their work in the episode description. Cover art for the show was done by Laurel Wong, and the music you're listening to was done by Neela Ruiz. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and this episode was produced and engineered by me. So if you found it interesting, send it to someone you know. South Pole is part of a larger network of sciencey podcasts called Pine Forest Media. We've got one on plastic, one on drinking water, and a couple of new ones coming out soon. So you can find more information about us in the episode description or on our website at pineforestpods.com. We are also on Instagram and TikTok at Pine Forest Media. And if you love the show and you want to support science communication like this, a 5-star rating across platforms and a review on Apple Podcasts is one of the best things you can do to help us reach more people and for the entire network to grow. All right, thank you to all of you who have made it this far, and we'll talk soon.